Hey everyone, welcome back to Eric's Everyday Watches. As always, if you like this video, if you find it helpful, please do me a favor, hit the like button and consider subscribing. The watch we're looking at today is the Seiko SRPE65. Now, for some reason, if you wanted to pay full retail price, you could pay $275 at the Seiko USA site, or simply pick it up from one of your gray market sellers such as Amazon or Joma Shop and pay closer to $165. It comes in this very basic box, which quite honestly is very underwhelming. There's a silver tone splashy pattern to it, which reminds me of decoupage. And if you don't know, decoupage is the art of tearing up paper and then gluing it back together. And if that sounds rather redundant and counterproductive to you, yeah, I think so too. And then in the end, you're left with something that looks a lot like this pattern. On top of the box, there's a Seiko 5 logo, which doesn't really stand out, and yet it's somehow not subtle enough to actually be classy either. But fortunately, we're not here for the box. We're interested in what's inside the box. The case and bezel of this watch are made of 316 stainless steel. The watch has mostly a polished finish to it, with the side of the case being polished, as is the top and bottom of the bezel. In the middle of the bezel, we have a chamfered edge, which has a brushed finish to it. Looking down at the lugs, we can see that there's a brushed finish which follows the curvature of the case, giving this watch a dual finish. Looking at the side of the case, we can see that there's not much of a downturn built into the lugs. But given its short 44mm lug-to-lug distance, it is very wearable, and it should fit just about everyone's wrist. This watch definitely has a little bit of a bezel-less dive watch feel to it, or a military-inspired aesthetic, which is actually what drew me to the watch to begin with. It definitely has the legibility that you'd expect from that style of watch, but what I wasn't expecting is the high amount of polish that is on this. It definitely collects fingerprints, and that's unfortunate. You know, if the high polish were simply on the sides of the case, you might not notice it. But given the fact that it's on top of the bezel and it surrounds the entire dial, it's hard not to see it. As far as fit and finish, the edges and corners of the case are ultra smooth. Everything is rounded off, leaving no sharp edges or corners to be found. In fact, the theme of this case seems to be one long, ever-flowing curve, with the only 90-degree angle being the inside of the lugs. There was something about this case that I just couldn't put my finger on what it reminded me of, with all of its rounded corners and lack of edges. And then I remembered the third-generation Ford Taurus, when they rounded off all the corners on the car and even the back window was an oval. You know, maybe that's a bit harsh, because I actually like this case. Maybe let's think of it more like an opal instead. Yeah, that's better. On the back of the watch, we have an exhibition screw-down case back, with text that reads Tin Bar, referring to its water capabilities, and also Made in Japan. Taking a look inside the engine room, we have Seiko's 4R36 movement. And just like all the new watches in Seiko 5's lineup, that movement is a 24-jeweler automatic movement, which does hack and it does hand wind. It is rated at a -30 to a +45 seconds accuracy per day. This movement does have a quick set date feature, a 40-hour power reserve, and beats at 21,600 beats per hour. You know, it's funny the things you notice when you start to review watches. I recently reviewed a Pagani design which uses a Seiko movement and found that to be very noisy. So now, as a result, I'm constantly listening to automatic watches. And I'm glad to say the Seiko 5 is exactly what you'd expect from a Seiko. Quiet and not distracting. That is in part what you're paying for when you buy this watch. You're paying for the Seiko quality. The crown at the 4 o'clock position is 6.5mm in width and 4mm in depth, which seems like a good size for this case. It is a simple push-pull crown, with the first position adjusting the day and date and the second position adjusting the time. The day and date are printed black on white and are very legible. It's done in a nice, sharp, crisp font that offers plenty of contrast. Now let's take a look at the dial. The metal indices are the same as on a Seiko 5 dive watch and are filled with Seiko's LumiBrite. Both the arrow tip minute hand and the hour hand are slightly thinner than what you're going to find on a dive watch. But the back of the second hand, we have the same loomed lollipop. And at night, this almost appears to be floating, which is a very cool effect. The thickness of the metallic borders on the indices matches the metallic borders on the hands. And that's a really nice attention to detail on Seiko's part, and something that I appreciate. It adds a little bit of subtle class here. Overall, the dial is very pleasant looking and has a clean aesthetic to it. It is extremely legible, which is exactly what you'd expect from a watch with a military or dive flair to it. At the 12 o'clock position, the Seiko logo is applied with the new 5 mark printed directly on the dial. At the 6 o'clock, automatic is printed in a script font, and at the 3 o'clock position, we have a simple day-date window, which is not outlined. Running around the chapter ring, we have a minute track printed in metallic silver. The green dial on this watch in normal indoor lighting appears to be a drab army green color, which is handsome, and definitely gives the watch a military-inspired feel to it. However, outside, in direct sunlight, the color tends to brighten up and move more into an olive green color. Personally, olives are kind of not my thing, not even in a martini. They just take up too much space. What I love about this dial, and I think is the star of the show, is Seiko's LumiBrite. Exposing this watch to the slightest amount of sunlight, even just walking past the window, and the hands and indices light up like Times Square on New Year's Eve. LumiBrite is absolutely one of Seiko's killer features. Topping off that dial, we have Seiko's proprietary Hardlex crystal. Hardlex is a mineral glass which has been tempered in high heat and then chemically treated with a combination of barium and silicone. While there are versions of this watch that come with a stainless steel bracelet, this SRPE65 model comes with a double pass Nato strap. It's 20 millimeters wide and longer than anyone is ever going to need. On my 7-inch wrist, I wear it on the 5th adjustment hole. Now there are 12 adjustment holes total. This means you'll either have an extra long flap sticking out, or you'll need to fold it under the keeper, or you'll need to cut it to the appropriate size for yourself. Now my first thought on this Nato was that it feels thin and cheap. It's roughly 1.3 millimeters thick, and it feels like a place the Seiko decided to cut some corners. But after wearing it, I realized that if it was actually thicker, it'd be tough to fold it under the metal keeper. That said, I'd rather the Nato be thicker and shorter and feel more substantial and just not have to tuck it back under the metal keeper to begin with. Luckily, at 20 millimeters, finding a replacement Nato should be an easy task, and chances are you already have one in your collection. Moving down the strap, we see the metal buckle is signed with the Seiko logo on it. So let's list out the specs for this watch. We have a Hardlex crystal, Seiko's 4R36 movement, a diameter of 40 millimeters, a thickness of 11.5 millimeters, a lug width of 20 millimeters, and a lug-to-lug distance of 44 millimeters. So let's wrap up by going over the pros and cons. For pros, legibility, both the time and the day date. The dial aesthetic. Whether you think it's a dive or military-inspired watch, it is a looker. You have Seiko's 4R36 movement, which hand winds, hacks, and it is a reliable movement. We have Seiko's LumiBrite, which I think is their absolute killer feature. And of course, you get the quality of a Seiko. For cons, this thing did collect a lot more fingerprints than I was expecting from this style of watch. But keep in mind, I'm shooting video of this under studio lighting, so you might not notice it quite as much. Also, that Nato strap is just too long and a little too thin. At a price point of around $165, there is a lot to like here with only a few downsides. I think the $100 to $200 price range is a tough market to compete in, And this watch clearly shows why Seiko does so well. They give you a lot of bang for your buck. And I'm sure it makes some of the competition a little green with envy. This has been Eric from Eric's Everyday Watches, reminding you to buy the watch that you love. And don't pay any attention to what anybody else says or thinks. This is your watch collection. If you like this video, if you find it helpful in any way, please do me a favor, hit the like button and consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next video.